Good evening and welcome to today's panel conversation on race, voice, representation, and collective memory in the mass media, digital media, and in technology. My name is Michael Delle Carpini. As many of you now know, I'm a faculty member and former dean of the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania and faculty director of the SNF Padilla program at Penn, whose mission is to facilitate robust, informed, and respectful dialogue on the many difficult, contentious issues facing the nation and the globe, and across the many ideological, cultural, and demographic divides that too often keep us from effectively addressing these issues. For those of you who are new to this series, this panel is the 11th of 13 we are holding over the course of this academic year as part of the Preceptorial on Racism and Anti-Racism in Contemporary America. The Preceptorial is designed for Penn undergrads, but each panel is open to the entire Penn community and to the larger public. Today's panel conversation is sponsored by the SNF Padilla program at Penn and co-sponsored by the Office of the Vice President for Social Equity and Community, the Office of the Provost, the Andrea Mitchell Center, Civic House, and New Student Orientation and Academic Initiatives, all as part of the Year of Civic Engagement here at Penn. Now, while inspired by events such as the murder of George Floyd and the resulting protests, demonstrations, and calls for change that emerged from them, this series of panel discussions is designed to explore the ways in which racism has long been embedded in our country's economic, housing, public health, criminal justice, education, cultural, media, and political systems, to better understand the root causes of this structural racism, and to identify what we have or might do to address these inequalities. I should note to the audience that you can use the Q&A function on your screens to ask questions. While we won't be able to answer all of them directly, we'll leave time towards the end of today's panel for me to ask our panelists some of them on your behalf. Now, we have another stellar panel to address today's issues and your questions, who I will now very briefly introduce. So if I could please ask the panelists to unmute your video so that people can see you as I do introductions. Great, thank you all. So first is John Jackson, the Walter H. Annenberg Dean of Penn's Annenberg School for Communication and the Richard Perry University Professor, an urban researcher, media ethnographer, anthropologist of religion, and theorist of race and ethnicity. Dean Jackson is the author of a number of important books, including Harlem World, Doing Race and Class in Contemporary Black America, Real Black, Adventures in Racial Sincerity and Impolite Conversations on Race, Politics, Sex, Money, and Religion. Dean Jackson, whose work also critically explores how film and other non-traditional or multimodal formats can be most effectively utilized, is one of the founding members of CAMERA, an initiative organized around creating visual and performative research projects and producing rigorous criteria for assessing them. He's also co-director and producer of a number of documentary films, including Bad Friday, Rastafaria After Coral Gables, and Making Sweet Tea, The Lives and Loves of Southern Black Gay Men. Nice to have you here, John. Our second panelist is Sarah Jackson, Presidential Associate Professor at the Annenberg School for Communication. Professor Jackson's research focuses on the ways media, journalism, and technology are used by and represent marginalized publics. She's author of Black Celebrity, Racial Politics and the Press, which examines the relationship between Black celebrity activism, journalism, and American politics, and co-author of Hashtag Activism, Networks of Race and Gender Justice, which explores the use of Twitter in contemporary social movements. As a 2020 Andrew Carnegie Fellow, her current book project focuses on the power and innovation of African-American media makers. Professor Jackson also serves as co-director of the Media Inequality and Change Center at Annenberg, which explores the intersection between media, democracy, technology, policy, and social justice. Welcome, Sarah. Our third panelist is Amy Hawn Nelson, research faculty member and the director of training and technical assistance for Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy, or AISP, an initiative of the University of Pennsylvania housed in the School of Social Policy and Practice that helps state and local governments collaborate and responsibly use data to improve the lives of community members. Prior to joining AISP in 2017, Dr. Hawn Nelson was the Director of Social Research for the UNC Charlotte Urban Institute and Director of the Institute for Social Capital, an integrated data system, or IDS, charged with supporting university research and data-informed decision-making in the Charlotte region. She is the lead author of A Toolkit for Centering Racial Equity Throughout Data Integration and co-editor of Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, School Desegregation and Resegregation in Charlotte. Prior to entering the world of IDS in 2012, Hawn Nelson served as a teacher and school leader for 11 years. She's a community-engaged researcher and has presented and written extensively on data integration and intersectional topics related to educational equity. Should also note that she lives in Charlotte with her husband, her two feisty daughters, and a naughty but lovable doodle. Welcome, Amy. And our fourth and final panelist is Matthew Miller, a Provost Postdoctoral Fellow in the City and Regional Planning Department of the Weitzman School of Design here at Penn. Dr. Miller's intellectual interests are economic development, placemaking and placekeeping, and visual spatial analyses, particularly on and for African diasporic communities. He is a photographer, storyteller, and geographer who approaches these topics using mixed methods. His publications include the journal article, If I Built the World, Imagine That, Reflections on World-Building Practices in Black Los Angeles, and is currently working on his first book project, exploring and theorizing around the geography of Black commerce, culture, and creativity in the United States. His intellectual work has been honored by the National Academy of the Sciences. His civic work has been recognized by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and his artistic and cultural work has been featured in the New York Times, Boston Globe, and Philadelphia Tribune, among other places. Thank you all for being here tonight. It's very much appreciated, since I know in these times that we're in right now, you are in great demand on these kind of topics. And so taking the time to participate in this panel means a lot to me. Thank you. Now, while today's panel is focused on issues of race, racism, media, and information and communication technology, among other technologies, I'd like to start, as I have most of the panels, by giving you all a chance to reflect on any recent events. For example, the recent elections and their aftermath, the first months of the Biden administration, the passage of one of the most problematic retrenchments of voting rights since Jim Crow in Georgia, the tragic killings of 6 Asian women in Atlanta, Georgia, the Derek Chauvin trial regarding the police killing of George Floyd, or any other recent events at Penn, in Philadelphia, or nationally, with implications for issues of race and racial justice. Really, this is just a chance to reflect, since this has been such, an ongoing issue in the United States and elsewhere, just a chance to reflect on current events to see if there's anything that's particularly moving you right now, or that you are reflecting on, or that seems relevant to the broad topic we're covering in this preceptorial. So, John, let me just start with you. What are your thoughts on these or any other recent events and the role of race in them, their implications, and so on? Anything on your mind right now?
Thanks for the invitation and for convening this series, Michael, and it's great to be a part of the conversation with you all. Folks are screaming outside my window. Hopefully, I never know if people could hear it.
No, it seems okay right now, yep.
Okay. So I guess, as at least an initial response to your question, Michael, I guess I would say for me, I've been spending a lot of time now just kind of thinking through not any particular event or discrete headlines. So clearly all of our eyes are on Minneapolis right now, and a lot of people are paying attention to what's going on with that case. I was particularly moved and troubled by one of the more recent anti-Asian attacks in New York, not just the attack itself, but the response of folks who saw it and not only did not come to the aid of the person who was assaulted, but then seemed to simply move on, and which for me was such an incredible indictment of our larger cultural universe right now, and our instinctive sensibilities around these questions. But when I think about how I'm imagining how encumbering it is to be engaging race in 2021, I think about how each one of these individual events, you can pluck out any number of them, right? Almost every day, we have a plethora, we have access to all of this material. Like, to me, it's almost more about trying to figure out how to make sense of and navigate a world, a social media landscape where at any moment, 24 hours a day, there's a ubiquitous representation almost of the most horrific versions of our racial id, right? The return of the repressed, of our racial hatreds and animus and irrationalities. And there's a version of how all those, for me, discrete, individualized cases almost seem to blur together in this incredibly depressing and impossible, for me at least, to wrap my head around way. And I know there's a version, I think, of the impact that has in toto on our collective conscious, on our individual abilities to even think about the kinds of personal interventions we can make, even just on our general mental health, that to me is about the sort of cumulative impact of how the mass mediatization of our racial madness actually overdetermines the kinds of ways in which we can even imagine interacting with one another in the 21st century. I don't know if we were built as a species. In fact, I'm pretty sure we weren't, to navigate this kind of social landscape. And so the question is, how do we then respond in a way that's up to the challenge, the unprecedented, I would argue, challenge of a media ecology that makes it more difficult to be humane to one another, given all the irrational, dysfunctional ways in which we've cultivated this sense of almost bizarre, essentialized indifference to folks we imagine to be us's instead of them's. And so for me, it's kind of, that's a long-winded way to say,
I get it.
All of these things are almost one big blob of inescapable and pathological dysfunction that I don't know how to make sense of. I know we have to do the work of teasing things apart, but I think we also have to pay attention to the cumulative impact they all have as they feed on one another and make it more impossible, I think, for us to even imagine a collective, a future, a body politic that can deal with all these forms of difference that will continue to constitute who and what we are as a society.
Yeah, no, I mean, those are points that hopefully we will unpack at least a little bit in the rest of the conversation. But the larger point you're making, especially in the era of COVID, when the technology is the only way we're actually interacting with each other, it feels like point is extremely well taken. Sarah, any reflections from you on the broader issue?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I hope I have at least one suggestion about how we sort of reorient ourselves in relation to each other. And this is something I've been thinking about, well, pretty much my whole career, but you asked us to connect it to recent events. So I'll say it's something that I've been thinking about in relation to a couple recent events, which is both the uprisings, in last summer, 2020, and also the recent crimes in Atlanta that specifically targeted Asian women. And that is thinking about the importance of who's telling stories and who is telling the stories that we rely on as a country, as a nation, as a collective. And this is, of course, the link to the media that I'm really thinking through, which was, if you were following things last summer, there were suddenly all these articles and think pieces about the revolt inside America's newsrooms. And they were specifically talking about how Black journalists were speaking out. They were just like Black folks on the street were speaking out. Black journalists inside of legacy institutions like the New York Times and others were speaking out about some of the ways in which white standpoints and white epistemologies really prevented them from doing the wholeness of their jobs in terms of telling Black stories for their careers. And this isn't actually something new, right? I mean, this is something that Black media makers have been talking about since forever, is that often these institutions really limit the ways we're telling these stories, thinking about social problems and thinking about perceived solutions, because the logics and norms that have become seemingly objective, so to speak, are actually logic and norms that are based in white sensibilities. And Wesley Lowery, formerly of the Washington Post and now at CBS News, wrote a great piece sort of critiquing the way that the concept of objectivity is weaponized against Black journalists, for example. But we saw case after case of this last summer, where, for example, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette actually took 2 Black journalists off of the George Floyd protest coverage because they felt that they had tweeted things that were too sympathetic to the protesters, which is really like an interesting stand to take when the protesters are protesting the murder of an unarmed person, right? And as if you're not allowed to be both a Black person in the world and a person who has a profession in journalism and feel sympathetic to that, right? And I was thinking about that recently because I actually just today tweeted a piece that was a great analysis looking at the difference in mainstream media coverage of the shootings in Atlanta and the way that the Korean language media covered that violence, and the way in which the imagined audiences and the in-group knowledge about particular experiences of anti-Asian racism and immigration and labor really differentially shaped the way mainstream media told the story of what happened in Atlanta, which often included taking as credible the narrative of the murderer as in terms of like his logics and motivations, and also the narratives of people from outside that community, including the police, as compared to how Korean language media, where this was very close to home and they're sort of more familiar, covered the story in a much more holistic way. And so I'm really thinking about how in this moment where I hear John and like the overwhelm of the information, and especially the overwhelm of what feels like the constant inundation of images of violence and other forms and questions about inequality and racism, that we actually have, I think, an informational route out of this that has very much to do with which stories, whose voices, which media we hear and listen to. And, part of that call, I think, is for media institutions to really rethink and change some of their norms, but also as audiences.
Yeah, there's so much in what you said that I hope we return to as we get to the specific topics. I just wanted to mention that Philadelphia Inquirer also had one of those racial reckonings where the reporters and staff of color did an open letter about some of the same issues that you've just described. And I also think in terms of your comment about the murder of the Asian women in Atlanta, that part of what I think fits into the way you just described it is just the whole odd discussion about was it a hate crime or not. And what that whole discussion was just, it felt like it was not getting to what was happening, and that's part of the way in which kind of mainstream media would because there are laws about hate crime and they have definitions, and they thought they were doing what they were supposed to be doing. So the point's really, really well taken. I want to return to a number of those, but Amy, what's been on your mind these days as we deal with these kind of issues?
Yeah, well, I'm going to take the unusual opportunity to be a voice of positive outlook, yep. Which I make my world in government-held data, held in integrated data systems. That's usually not my role on a panel, but I see a lot of positive news in my world, especially in rates of vaccination data, in thinking about administrative data systems and the importance of data and how these data are critical for solutions and policies and evaluating programs. And as far as racial equity goes, we see just such a huge shift. A year ago, we were having conversations pre-COVID around missingness in data systems. A lot of state-held data systems would have 60% missingness of race and ethnicity data, or have race and ethnicity data in one field combined. And the conversations have just completely shifted, right? There's no one at the state level or county or city level. There's no owner of data that thinks that 60% missingness of data for race and ethnicity is acceptable, right? And in light of COVID and the racialized disparities we see, and the need for accurate data, that conversation is night and day. And I don't know anything else that could have happened to make it such a dramatic shift. I work in glacially paced work. I work with governments. I work with, we still have state systems using COBOL. like decade-old programming languages, right? So the fact that we've been able to make this shift so quickly is magical to me. I also think it's really interesting to look at the way that vaccination data is really being used. Like, we're actually implementing things using data, like, mind-altering. So I think there's a lot of positive coming from this. I think we've had to shift quickly, and people are doing it in really smart ways, with significant fiscal constraints, not taking a lot of money. They're using resources that are already there, tools that are already there. There's a lot of open source tools. There's a lot of just better understanding of what's available and making it happen. So
that's great. Thank you.
I see it. Yeah, blue skies ahead on that front.
Well, that's really encouraging, and I hope that we will be able to get at both sides of these issues. But that's a great, hopeful story. So thanks for that, Matt. From your corner of the world, what have you been thinking about in terms of these issues?
Well, I think I feel like I want to sort of split the baby here between some of the sort of nihilism and the sort of optimism that we rightfully all feel right now, because this is just such a complex issue, and I've been really thinking about the question of, like, what do we want? How do we want our generation and our our sort of collective memory to be about race after the sort of the last year, if not more. For a lot of us have been paying attention to race prior to the pandemic and prior to the election of the last president. And I'm seeing this fork in the road. I feel like I'm seeing a fork in the road between sort of, a sort of recession and a sort of resurgence of white nationalism. And on the other side, I'm seeing sort of I want to say reconstruction and a sort of, reckoning with reparations that is rising up from the bottom and sort of trying to clash together in this sort of larger culture war. And as someone that's sort of, thinking about, like, culture and cities, it's really interesting. One of the things that I've been really, so on the side of sort of the challenges, I second everything that Sarah and John have mentioned about, seeing this deluge of hate crimes and of domestic terrorism, and really sitting with the gravity of those things, and then really seeing media sort of do this guessing game about whether it's actually occurring or not. Sort of this, calling it into question right in front of us, making us second guess ourselves. That's one sort of current. But I was actually reminded this morning on the sort of other current of things that, when we fight against those things, we win. We make progress. There's a study that Black Futures Lab, which is run by Alicia Garza of the Black Lives Matter movement, released this morning, which is very interesting. There's no sort of like one single call out finding of it, but one sort of tidbit of it that I was sitting with was that since October of 2020, up till the last time they surveyed the group of respondents, there has been a sort of shift in the question about how satisfied are you with the direction of the country? It was 84% dissatisfied in October of 2020, and now it's down to overall like 34%, which is a big shift. And I don't, say that to say that everybody feels that way, but just that the sort of effort to understand where our country is going is running in multiple directions. There's a lot of different, what seems like sort of contradictory findings that are running parallel. And I think the activism and the sort of racial reckoning of last summer produced some sort of short-term signs that, okay, like Black resistance matters. But at the same time, now we're seeing over, New York Times reported over 110 crimes, in the last year that have been reported, at least against, Asians. And so that doesn't sit well to hear them together. But I think all of it for me returns to this question of Reconstruction. And I'm sitting with the words of Sylvia Winter right now, who talks about how as humans, we are both flesh and story. We are both, we are, it's a philosophy she has about sort of remaking what it means to be human, and sitting with the face of all these inhumanities and really, seeing a lot of ways that people are pushing back on this inhumane origin story about this country, seeing that it is for, people of all spectrums to belong. And so that's where I'm landing with it right now. But I realize that that's how I'm getting through it. But there are a lot of areas that just feel, really troubling. So I'd love to go into both of those with everybody.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think this introduction has both led us into the specific topic for today, but also the ways in which we can be torn in different directions on it. Its complexity, but signs of that you can point to of hope. Is this an inflection point or not? The points that both Matt and Amy made, counterposed in some ways to the points that John and Sarah made, are all real, right? They're all part of what's going on right now. I'll just add to that complexity the image of the three people in the hotel, where just outside of which that Asian American woman was attacked, that you were pointing to, John, and them not only just not ignoring it, they closed the door of the residential house, leaving her outside on the ground. But I have another image in my head that I've been turning to when I'm looking for hope, and that's the testimony of the witnesses of the George Floyd killing, who, no matter how people want to paint it, because we have it on video, were doing their civic duty and doing their best to try to help this man, save this person's life. And while the end of it is so sad, even the stress that those witnesses are feeling because they were unable to save his life, what they did, how they performed, what they tried to do is a moment of civic heroism. So, it's a complicated moment, I guess, is what I'm really saying, as you've all begun to point out. But let's continue the conversation by turning more specifically to the topic of today's panel. As you all know better than I do, mass media, digital media, other forms of information and communication technologies and data are ways in which we give voice to who we are as groups, as individuals, collectively, how we represent ourselves to ourselves and to others, and how we transmit who we are to future generations in America. Mass media and ICTs have had a complicated relationship with issues of social justice for African Americans, as you all know, sometimes being a tool for positive change, sometimes being responsible, or at least partly responsible for some of the issues of race and racism that have been really problematic in our history. So really what I'd like to do, what I've tried to do in these panels generally, what I'd like to do now is draw on your expertise to just talk about that a little bit. Tell us, the ways in which media, either mass media, new social digital media, technologies, information and communication technologies, or other technologies, how have they been complicit historically or at this current moment in issues of race, in helping to foster and maintain racist inequalities? But to the extent you want to, how can those technologies, or have those technologies, been used in ways that have been helpful in helping to address some of these inequalities? I mean, just imagine an audience that is not well versed in this. Part of the point here is to say, how does this, what is the issue that's keeping us up at night in terms of the role of media and digital technology? And that can be both statistical, provide some data on these things, but as importantly, humanize it. Case studies, examples of the ways in which the mass media, digital media, technology has played both these roles in contemporary America as it regards race. And Sarah, you really began to touch on this already in your comments, but if you would continue with some of those thoughts, and I know some of the work that you do has really addressed this issue. So if you would start us off on this question.
Yeah, sure. And for the record, I thought my other comments were hopeful. I didn't know they were not hopeful. But I was like, hey, we just have to listen to the right people.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's fair. I lumped you in with John when I shouldn't have.
No, it's fine. I'll be in a group with John anytime. So yeah, I mean, the history here is both complex and nuanced, and also there are some realities here, right? Which we know that just like every other institution in the United States, media institutions were founded in exclusionary practices, right? I mean, only people who were considered full citizens, full members of the public were reflected in the origins of our media systems. And so, of course, that meant elite white men who owned land, essentially, right, for many years. And it wasn't until movements and years later and all kinds of things that much of our media system became what we might call integrated, although we know that contemporarily this integration is very, very, very slow and stifled. In media systems, in terms of who is represented in them, still do not reflect what the American public looks like in terms of diversity. And so, of course, like what we know in terms of the problems then are the same problems that you find in any other institution, which has only reflected the needs and values of not just a single group of people, but the group of people in power who it benefits to exclude others. And, you know, one of the sort of classic examples I use it often in my work is the journalism of Ida B. Wells, who was a Black woman journalist who reported on the lynching epidemic in the United States at the turn of the 20th century. And at the time, the reason that Ida B. Wells had to do this, she founded her own newspaper and she, wrote her own publications, was because the mainstream media of the time, which was a segregated white media, either ignored lynchings altogether as a social problem or more often justified them through the language of supposed Black criminality, of supposed Black danger, of stereotypes of Black male rapists. And what we know now from the analysis is what Ida B. Wells was reporting was exactly what was true, which was that, in fact, often the charges brought against Black men who were lynched, by the way, not in a court of law, but by mobs, right, were often trumped up and faked and simply depended on anti-Black stereotypes to sort of justify this very gleeful and vulgar form of violence that was enacted in communities all across America for decades. And, you know, what we see there is we see one part of the press, right, one tool, the printing press, being used to justify this violence, to sideline this violence, to normalize this violence. But what we also see is journalists like Ida B. Wells and other Black journalists at the time saying, no, we're going to use this same technology, this same tool to tell the correct story, to correct the record. And so I think at any time we can take sort of any media platform, we can, from, you know, film, journalism, whatever, and we see a similar history, comparative history happening here, which is that the media that are the most powerful and have most influenced public opinion and public politics and public conversations have often been complicit in racialized violence, in racial segregation, in creating racial stereotypes. And I mean, I could probably go on for the rest of the evening with examples of this from every era. But at the same time, there have always been folks pushing against that. So there have always been in every era a cohort of Ida B. Wellses who are trying to correct the record, tell the story, document the thing. And they do force often the mainstream to respond. I mean, Ida B. Wells was successful, in fact, in launching an anti-lynching campaign in the United States and moving public opinion and even policy in a direction against it. And so what we see really then is a battle, not to go back too much to my first comments, of power about who gets to tell the story and who we believe in the story in terms of when we think about the power of media.
Yeah, and who gets to tell the story is crucial in all of this, I think. So I don't feel bad about reemphasizing that point, because I think it's one of the major root causes that we'll talk a little bit about in why we have the kind of media representations that we do. But Amy, would you like to talk a little bit about from your area of expertise on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I would just love to continue on Sarah's point. I mean, you look at the work of Ida B. Wells Barnett, and you look at the work of W.B. Du Bois, and why, in many ways, why was their work so powerful? And some would say, like me, because they had numbers, right? They put data to these really complex stories about people that were at the aggregate, but they told detailed stories using data, right? So I think this is a huge part of the work we do, is acknowledge that the administrative data are the data that folks are using to tell these stories and to better understand what's going on in our human services in particular, and then use the information, hopefully, to improve policy and programs, right? But the real challenge here is that these systems were built to replicate social systems, right? And social systems replicate systems built to, uphold and maintain white supremacy, which was built to control Black and brown bodies, which was built to support our economic system that relies upon labor exploitation, right? So it's like this crazy mix of horribleness that is what comes out in our administrative data systems, right? But we are told this fallacy that data are race neutral. I mean, I can't even tell you the number of students that I interact with, and adults and everyone, data scientists, in my world, database administrators, who tell me, race are neutral. That's why, or data are neutral. That's why I like it. And so we work really hard to contextualize these data, to put sociological understanding around the systems that really describe every session of this series, right? I went back and Michael and listened to a lot of these before this session, and was just struck by every single session is data that's captured by government data, right? Income, that's IRS revenue data, workplace data, that's staffing data, housing, health, incarceration, policing, schooling. All of those have data systems that we use to describe and better understand them. And so we have to understand racial equity and how those data are racialized, and how to work against that to center racial equity within using those systems. So we like to think about this as data systems being our century's infrastructure project. So in our toolkit that Michael mentioned in my intro, we talk about how, 1800s, we built railroads, right? That was our infrastructure. 1900s, we built highway systems. And both of those infrastructure projects decimated communities, right? There are horrors done to communities, mostly Black and brown communities, in the name of progress. And so we really work hard in our work with government agencies to get people to think about data infrastructure as our next century's work. And then we have to think about racialized harm. We have to think about the underpinnings of these structures in order to not replicate the harms that happen in our previous infrastructure projects.
That's great. I want to return to the notion of data infrastructure and get your sense of the Biden infrastructure plan, which I think is built partly on what you described, but I'd like to hear you as an expert on that. I'll also say that when it comes to data, it's also a question of the data that is not collected, as I'm sure you know. And in some of the issues that you mentioned, like criminal justice, that's been part of the structural racism, is what data is collected and what data is not collected. So it's not only how it's contextualized, but what data we even have on certain kinds of issues. So thank you for that, and we'll return to some of those issues. Matt, give us your thoughts on sort of the state of play in the areas that you work in.
Well, Amy, you offered some great sort of anchors for the way I think about sort of race and media and the built environment and how they sort of interact. This is by design. I mean, the way that I'm thinking about this is really, so take sort of in deference to the fact that we have some like legit national, international media experts, I'm just going to size it down to the city level here to talk about this.
No, that's great. That's great.
I really think about, the fact that we have media deserts. We have areas with like areas outside of major media markets with no newspapers, and they're being, I think of this sort of Bloombergification, like of our media, like they're being funneled into these major media sort of networks in one sense, and then we have Foxification with television as well. A lot of local TV reporting that happens within these sort of aggregate sort of stations that miss a lot of things, and they're not able to actually follow up on keep up with certain beats on certain stories. And I'm thinking about the sort of narrative around urban revitalization and how, like to your point, Amy, that in the name of progress, so much stigma and desecration has happened to Black communities that were labeled as blighted or were labeled as crime-ridden. And part of that has to do with the structure of storytelling as well. Not just that it's not localized enough, but also the fact that it's not even serial storytelling, it's episodic. Black male listed as this thing, it's atomized in this way, and constant deluge of that story has effects on people. It sets agendas. It creates a perception that has impacts on the built environment. It impacts the real estate industry. People don't want to invest or take the first leap into a neighborhood or in a city that is constantly portrayed as, as Philly often has in the statewide context, being portrayed as a black hole, as sort of a waste of resources, as a corrupt place. These are stigmas and perceptions that have impacts. And so I think about that a lot. I'm really sitting, with and also just in this moment that we're in. There was a great piece that Jay Rosen at NYU mentioned about sort of the path that the media industry has in front of it, like this sort of fork in the road, and the aftermath of the sort of Trump administration, and how they basically gave him $5 billion of free unearned media as he was campaigning, and allowed him to cycle these lies and myths and toxic narratives that we're now seeing, have impacts on the way people behave, and how, at the very last minute, the media decided, oh, we're going to turn off the White House because they're lying. I think it was barely even a week before the election where they decided to do that. And, I have the quote of, I think his name is Les Moonves, the CBS chairman, in my head. It's infamous quote where he said, "It may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS." And he was saying that in response to this notion that Trumpism is, and controversy around that, is profitable for big media. And we really have to sit with that. And I think, Michael, you mentioned that as well, the issue of ownership. I definitely want to go into that more. And that's where I'm sort of coming from with this. But who owns these stories? How do we actually control the narrative at every scale?
Yeah. Yep. No, that's great, Matt. And definitely let's return to the issue of ownership when we talk about some of the causes of the issues that we're describing right now. I should mention that the Philadelphia Inquirer again is doing, as part of the racial reckoning, is looking hard at the content of its coverage over the past number of years, with a realization that that they haven't done, even in a city. You mentioned cities that are media deserts, but even in a city like Philadelphia that has now at least one major newspaper, and previous years more, that doesn't mean that it is covering the community writ large, and they're coming to at least appreciate that that's been the case in the past, and then hopefully trying to address it as they go forward. But John, why don't you tell us a little bit about your thinking on where we stand right now?
So I guess I'm enjoying listening to the other panelists. I guess I would probably just second a lot of what has already been said, which I think has been incredibly helpful, and just maybe add 2 points. It's really just extensions, I think, on what folks have already said. The first, I think, is that even before we get to the question of representation, that we should always be reminded of the fact that racist logics are already embedded in the technology, right? Already embedded in the algorithms and the data, right? So we often want to imagine that these are sort of neutral technological innovations that we can then deploy one way or the other, when we also have to recognize that whether it's the kinds of ways different cameras respond to different hued bodies, whether it's all the different assumptions we make about what should be behind the black box of the algorithmic model, that so much of what we think and believe about racial difference and hierarchy is already baked into these technologies. And I think that's an important thing to remember, because it's hard to tease them out in a way. I think the other thing I would add is there's a version of what we always, I think, can, for the sociologists, we can always appreciate the intervention they remind us of, which is that when we talk about the stories that we bandy about vis-a-vis issues of race and racial difference, that one of the concerns is that no matter whether it's legacy media, Hollywood, social media, that we have this tendency, we've internalized an assumption about the generalizability of the stories we tell that seem to presuppose certain kinds of subjects telling universal stories and other subjects telling very specific, particularized stories. And there's a logic there, I think, that also is important for us to come back to, because part of what it means then is you have this continuing reproduction of almost, even despite the fact that there's so many more Black media makers putting out incredible content today, it's not read in the same way often as by the mainstream media, especially as content being put out by folks who aren't so marked and racialized. And I think there's a version of that dynamic that we're still trying to grapple with. And we have techniques to go to sort of Sarah's point earlier. It's not like that's the end of the story. There are all these ways in which people are pushing back against some of those assumptions and creating their own counter narratives, their counter publics that can both understand, appreciate, and value those sorts of counter productions. But I do think that's an important point to lay out. It's one of the reasons why I think figures like Tyler Perry, who often gets lampooned in mainstream media, are important. Not simply, I think, because they're telling stories by and about Black folks, but they're also imagining that part of the project has to be about controlling the means of media production and finding ways to do that, right? Again, jury's always out on the quality of what people then produce, but I think there's a version of that element of this larger story that has to be emphasized, because if we don't do that, I think we fall into this trap of reproducing a whole set of, I think, outdated claims about how you represent race, about how straightforward and explicit race is. I think it's the other thing often we get wrong. We often only are able to translate racial dynamics into representations that are hard and fast, right? Good guys over here with white hats on, the bad guys over there with black hats on for all time. The subtleties, the nuances, they don't often play on TikTok in that way. They don't often play clearly in standard Hollywood and television fare. And so I think just trying to figure out a way to push ourselves to use all this new technology to unlearn some of what we've been taught about how we translate that into images and sound that actually can be empowering to more people, not just invisibilizing folks who aren't already considered mainstream.
Yeah. Again, great, important points. And I want to turn now, although you've already done the work for me by beginning to talk about this, to talk about, you've raised a number of issues, problematic issues in the structure of the media environment, as well as the content of the media environment. You've also said what the root cause of this is, so I don't want to beat a dead horse. I mean, ultimately, I think you all said it, but Amy put it most succinctly when she talked about the various layers that lead back to the U.S. economy and the use of labor that leads to certain structures, leading to certain outcomes and representations. But so we can talk more about that, about the deep-seated structural racism that underlies this, and I'm happy to have you elaborate on that. But also, and some of the points that John just made about how those structures play out, but also the more proximate causes that that's a set of realities that we live with. There are a set of realities that at some level we've known about and we've tried to talk about publicly, certainly in the academy, but I think even more generally, at least at moments, we're doing that right now. But it's resistant. And so if we could talk a little bit about your sense of what the structural impediments are to the information environment we live in now, the extent to which, as Matt said, that this is economic and issues of ownership, and how much of it is technological in and of itself, political, how much of it is literally explicit racism, that it is not the byproduct of these kinds of economic issues, but it is embedded in it as explicit racism. And how does it vary? Does it vary by medium? Are the problems we face with digital media different than the problems we face with mainstream television or film or print media? So just talk a little bit about what you see either from your own work or your own observations as being both the root cause, but also more proximate causes of what makes this such an incredibly difficult, complicated issue to try to address. And Amy, since you started us off on that kind of embedded layering of what the root cause is, if you could talk either a little bit more about that or about more specific in the area of data development, the more day-to-day proximate causes that makes it difficult to get to where you'd like to get to.
It's a good question. I feel like books could be written about this question.
Yeah,
I'm going to go with one of my favorite tools for questions like this. It's if Amy had a magic wand.
Yeah.
I have 2 little girls at home. We do a lot of magic wand activities. So if Amy had a magic wand, one way I would get people to deal with this is, one, I would make everyone read like a certain reading list. I'm not beholden to certain books, but like I need everyone who wants to really have a conversation about this to have a deep historical understanding of where we are, where we have been. There are so many books that do this well. Like I need everyone to understand that we are all racist. We are if you are in the U.S. and you exist in any way in the U.S., you are racist. We are all racist, right? Racist water, racist air, everything. So I think like that is the number one, and then you can have a real conversation. To me, a huge part of that is staffing. In my world, my magic wand would have something to do with staffing. It would be to pull people into data work that have some kind of sociological understanding or some kind of historical grounding in social systems, why they exist, where they came from. Like I need people to know that, policing started with slave patrols. I need people to know that social workers, are just person-to-person surveillance when it began. I need people to know the historical roots. And then the data systems are, we need to work against those roots to make sure that we're using data in a meaningful manner that can actually shift outcomes positively rather than just replicating over and over and over. I think a lot of that has to do with staffing. We have pipeline issues in the data world, especially. I'll frame this as like 2 approaches. You can take a social worker and teach them how to do data things, or you can take a data person and teach them how to be a social worker. I am a fan of the latter. the former. I'm a fan of taking someone who has a deep agency level expertise and experience. They can look at a spreadsheet and put pictures in their head of who that person is on that spreadsheet. They can look at a query from a data system and have a picture of those families that query represents, right? That is very difficult to teach. So I would really like to see, again, Amy Magic Wand, I would love to see pipeline systems for staffing that take folks with on the ground experience working in human service agencies and then teach them the data skills to use those data effectively for decision making. And I'll stop there. I have other magic wand ideas, but I won't bore everyone.
That's great, and we can return.
That would be my main one.
We can return to your magic wand when we get to the last question because it's relevant to that. But that's helpful. Thanks for starting us off on this, Matt. Your sense of, both a long-standing and more proximate causes of the serious issues that you've all raised in media representation.
Yeah, I think I'm sitting with the structural dimension, the political economic sort of dimension of the media landscape, and the question of ownership. And I talked about it a little bit with newspapers. But as someone that's like an LA scholar, like I think about Hollywood, I can't not think about it. And there's great reporting on this. They call it sort of the Hollywood report UCLA puts out every year. And they talk about, the fact that, yes, like on-screen representation in film, television, is becoming more diverse in terms of actors and things like that. But the quality of the story, to sort of John's point, is still flat. And there's all kinds of reports that they've done to show that. There's one called Representation Matters, or it's a hashtag Representation Matters by the National Research Group that really calls out that saying 67% of Black viewers don't feel like they're actually represented on TV. It's stereotypes. It's still not, showing us like, the mixed race individuals, the, Black gay men, the Black transgender people, the Black non-binary people. I feel that personally as someone who's Black and gay, openly gay. And so I think that there's it's still boiling down to who is in control. And so they're finding that overwhelmingly it's still white men that are in control of large studios, of networks that get to decide and greenlight which content goes on, and it really runs the risk of flattening stories into what are the respectable ones versus the ones that are sincere and truthful. And so I'm sitting with ownership in that sense of it. I'm also sitting with some, of the reports, and I don't hear people talk about this very much, but the way that the sort of Federal Communications Commission at the FCC grants broadcast licenses, they actually, it's an auction process. And like, if you have to pay a certain fee to be in the auction to win a license that allows you to broadcast your content, whether it's digital, whether it's on television screens, that's really reliant on capital. And we know how racism affects wealth in this country. And so people don't have the capital to compete in an auction. And there's a great paper that I read about this where, it was actually an analyst from the FCC who did this and had to actually sue to get them to allow him to publish this report in the review of the Journal of Black Political Economy, talking about how it's virtually impossible for a Black firm to win in an auction. And so you don't have a chance at being able to, provide this sort of structural counterweight to the overwhelming whiteness that deluges, and is spread out in the mainstream psyche. And so, I'm really sitting with ownership in that sense of it, that there are structures and laws and policies that can be redesigned to better allow people access into that opportunity structure, really, around storytelling.
That's great. And again, I want to return to that a little bit, but the point you're making is a really important one. And to some degree, I wonder how much that is media specific, whether certain types of media have affordances that allow for greater voice for African Americans, for marginalized groups more generally, even when the ownership pattern is off a bit.
Well, Michael, just on that note, I mean, on journalism, I mean, I think about the laws that certain congressmen have proposed. I'm blanking on the name right now, but I think it was HR 1661, way back in like 2005 or something, where it would provide public funding for local newspapers, because we are in this very corporatist capitalist model for reporting, and so it's privatized. It really is a barrier for people. If you have to rely on subscriptions, you have to rely on corporate sponsorships and things to get a newspaper off the ground. And so I think for me, I see that the reason why I'm saying this, I think it cuts across almost any part of the media landscape.
Yeah, no, that's a absolutely fair point. You're right. In many ways, there's a lot less public subsidy for newspapers today than there was earlier in U.S. history. And so, though it's never been a public medium, there's been more government public support based on the way tax laws were written and other kinds of laws were written than we have today. And the regulatory issues have been relaxed at the same time that ownership has become more centralized. Philadelphia now basically has the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Philadelphia Tribune as the only newspapers that are really citywide in Philadelphia. And the move to online versions of print paper for economic reasons is only going to exacerbate some of the points that you mentioned. So all excellent points. John, why don't you give some of your thoughts on this issue of the root and proximate causes of the kinds of problematic issues that you've all been raising?
So I guess I would start by saying it is important maybe to speak a little bit to one of the themes Amy brought up. It's important for us to be honest and accurate in how we tell the history of this country and of global processes, right? So, and which doesn't mean sort of skewing it necessarily so that it tells a story that we feel like is in service to racial justice. I think just telling the honest story gets us farther away from some of the commitments we have in mythologizing our past, which makes us less open to the idea of being honest about the past impact on the present. So I think trying to find ways to more honestly excavate some of that history it's critical. If we don't do that, I don't think we have a chance of building the kind of future we want to build. I also do agree that there's a version of what is at stake here that's also, for me, always about remembering that no matter how good the argument is, no matter how good the data, the science, the rationale is we have for, say, racial inclusion or equity, that so much of this commitment isn't just in people's minds, it's in their hearts and souls too, which is part of what makes all of these multimodal platforms and vehicles from Hollywood to TikTok so important, because not only do they get information out, but of course they play on our emotions and affect, and they get at that sense of who and what we think we are and what we think we feel. Du Bois had this famous quote in The Souls of Black Folks: "How does it feel to be a problem?" I think there's a version of what's also really important for us to recognize is it actually feels really good to consider other people a problem as a function of their racial identity. And so how do we get people to unlearn that and give that up, divest from that kind of inflated sense of collective self that's predicated on the demonization and racialization of other people? I don't know how we do it, but we can't do it by simply imagining the data or the science or the argument is going to get us to the finish line. I mean, clearly we need good arguments and we need facts, right? So this isn't, about championing some world where facts don't matter, but it's about recognizing that the facts already have inside, Trojan horsed inside all of them, these politicized understandings of how we use them in service to the goals we have for the kind of community we want to build. And so I think trying to find a way to think about intellectual honesty and rigor, along with sort of affect, emotion-filled commitments to this stuff at the same time, is critical. And that's one of the reasons why it becomes so important to figure out and make sense of what we're doing in film, television, journalism, social media, because these are these spaces that are hothouses for the kind of weird sparks that fly when our minds and our hearts kind of connect in that way.
Yeah, I mean,
sort of really.
I mean, those are really powerful points. And I see Amy, who's the data scientist among us, nodding her head. That is true. That the combination is really important. I often wonder. I mean, we're in a moment where we talk about being a post-fact world, and facts seem to matter less than they used to in some ways. I mean, that can be exaggerated, and I often wonder whether, because your point that facts and emotions, information and feelings need to be combined. There are times when I think that the decline in the authority of facts are in part to prevent that combination from happening. And it's just another example of some of the structural biases that we're talking about. When the facts don't align with the way a majority of the public feels on issues of race, or wants to ignore issues of race, those facts are easier to ignore sometimes. But that puts us down a pretty negative rabbit hole if that's true. So, but the way you put that, I think, is really valuable. Sarah, your thoughts on what long-term and proximate causes of the current dilemma we face?
Yeah, I really appreciate my colleagues' comments here. And I guess I would just say that I think the solution, I mean, I don't want to overstate that it's easy, but I'm actually like, we know what to fix, which is that these institutions and organizations have embedded, multi-generational norms and values. And if you're trained in journalism, you literally know in journalism school, you learn the norms and values of the practice of journalism, right? And they have to do with things like who's a legitimate source and who's not a legitimate source, how you write a catchy headline, right? Who your audience, your presumed or imagined audience is, what heuristic shortcuts you use when you're reporting on a complex issue, but you only have 800 words to do it, right? And these things are actually trained into media professionals. And those things that I just listed are examples of norms in the profession that cause problems that we need to rethink, right? So take the question of legitimate sources, right? Well, for generations and generations and generations, journalism students were taught that people in authority are more legitimate sources than ordinary people on the street. So what happens when an incident of police brutality happens and the journalists who report on that incident have been trained for their whole lives and internalized the idea that the police are more legitimate in terms of being able to who we believe and who we trust on telling the story than the witnesses who were standing there and saw it. Well, we get what we've seen over and over and over and over again, right? Which are these passive voice headlines, man shot by, instead of saying what actually happened, right? Or we get the person's criminal background, even though that had nothing to do with the incident that's actually being reported on, right? We get all kinds of problematic reporting because, in fact, those supposedly legitimate sources have a specific standpoint that they are committed to, just like all sources and our people, that isn't in fact more legitimate than anybody else's, right? And that's something we could undo. I really believe we could undo that in a generation of training of journalists. I mean, similarly, when we think about entertainment media, the assumption of who the base audience is, right? Where for so many generations, the assumption was made that the base audience was like a Leave It to Beaver family, a white, upper middle class, suburban family with a picket fence. And they certainly wouldn't want to see anything that seemed, too, both literally and figuratively colorful, right? Or too gritty or too controversial or too sexy or too, whatever. And that assumption about the audience has kept us from telling complex and nuanced stories about queer characters and poor characters and characters of color, right? And again, I really think that's something that not only could we undo that training if we were really committed to undo that training, and if institutions were really committed to checking their own biases as they come through that training, but it's not even reflective of reality anymore, right? I mean, it never was. Let me be clear. America never looked like Leave It to Beaver, right? I mean, ever, ever, ever. But certainly it doesn't anymore, right? And what we want, in fact, is a diversity of stories. And so, like, I think so many of these things, and you know, even down to Amy's point, when it comes to technology, there are so many opportunities to think about things like artificial intelligence, things like code, things like all these things that we know have embedded racist biases in them because of the ways it was assumed that because they were technology, they couldn't possibly be biased. That if we, in fact, rethought their design and rethought who they were being designed for, we might end up with a different technology. Now, of course, you know, we have to have another conversation about the economics of this, because, you know, there's an argument here, and I think Amy made it quite well earlier, that part of why some of this doesn't happen is because the biases being built in serves powerful constituencies and serves institutional inequalities that exist across, you know, different types of organizations and platforms and parts of American society. So we need to dismantle that, right? But certainly, like, some of these things are things that in the short term we could very much tackle in the day-to-day sort of behaviors of how media is made.
Yeah, I mean, again, excellent points, and I think the point you just made, coupled with the points that Amy and John and Matt's point about ownership, which is one way of making it more likely that you would get the kinds of changes that you've just described. I just want to give one example that it is, you know, related to the point you made about the norms of journalism and the beat system that leads to giving the point of view from the police rather than from the victim or the witnesses. That is true. It's also true that layered on top of that is what I would call explicit racism. And there's a great example of the way in which the crack cocaine epidemic was covered by journalists, television journalists, as compared to the cocaine addiction issue, which was, you know, with the broad generalization that crack cocaine was an issue that affected minority communities more, whereas cocaine, while it affected minority communities, was also the drug of choice among white middle class people. And even the camera angles of the news broadcast, when it was covering a story about crack cocaine, it was from the view of the police breaking into a crack house or breaking into a house, whereas the camera angle on the coverage of cocaine addiction was more often from the view of the addicted person, treating them as a real subject in that story, and from that point of view. And so there are even subtle aspects of camera angle that are not only part of the ritual and norms that need to be changed, but the embedded racism that underlies those rituals and norms, I think.
I mean, we just saw that in the last 5, 6, however many years, in all of a sudden, you know, the remarkable number of deep dive stories about the white working class, right? And whenever people talked about the working class and us needing to understand the working class better, they were only talking about the white working class.
Yeah. How often do you hear the phrase black working class?
Because when people imagine, and this includes media makers, the black working class, they imagine stereotypes.
Yeah, right? That's right. That's
right. And they think they cover that because they have a crime beat, which is just racist thinking, right?
Yeah.
We so many examples of this.
Which is why I go back ultimately to some of the points that Matt made, that it's hard to imagine these changes. I mean, you can imagine these changes happening within the limits of the economic system we have, because there are financial reasons to make these changes. You pointed them out, Sarah, about the fact that the economics of the reality of our society is such that turns out if you have diversity in advertising, you can actually reach larger audiences. The fragmentation of audiences through cable and streaming channels means you can target your audiences in a way, but that's going to be more limited ultimately than you could do if you were really saying, let's break out of the economic model we have and think about the issues of justice. So we are running out of time, believe it or not, although you were great because you talked about solutions at the same time as you talked about causes. But I do want to bring up one question that I thought was really important. One of our audience members said that Sarah spoke about who gets to tell the story, and others of you did as well. And as someone seeking the stories, the question that came to me is who gets to see or hear the story? And I wonder if any of you would like to just address that issue, because it's an issue of production without question, but it feels like it's also an issue. And this is where the cost of technology and the availability of different formats become important. But the limits of audiences, the limits of audiences to be able to get the kinds of stories that, even if they are appropriate. Do any of you have any comments or thoughts about that side of the equation? I mean, I worry about that in Philadelphia. I'm a member of the Lenfis Institute board, and as the inevitable move towards online news continues to march forward, it's not only an issue of how the Philadelphia Inquirer covers stories in Philadelphia, but it's an issue of who's going to have access to them when it's technology driven. Do you have any thoughts on that question, any of you?
I'll quickly say that, I mean, Matt mentioned earlier the digital divide, which, the original ways we thought about the digital divide are quite different now, but certainly rural folks are really, really, really affected by the digital divide. And that's one thing, again, we could have a whole other panel on. But the other thing that I was going to say about this is that I think we desperately need media literacy. I think our K through 12 schools should be teaching critical media literacy so that audiences, so that, everybody can know how to find a news source. And part of this question in the chat was, which sources do I read to make sure I have this well-rounded understanding of what's going on? And we've seen that again in the last few years. People don't have necessarily the ability to tell, legitimate sources from sources that are propaganda, or, sources that are reported with certain types of norms and values from sources that are serving a political interest, right? And so I think part of the question for the audience is that the public at large needs better critical media literacy skills so that they can pick and choose their sources in an informed kind of way.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. Anybody else have any thoughts on that before we begin to wrap up?
I guess I would just also add as an extension on that point, is that democratization of the media doesn't help us in the kind of context that Sarah lays out, because not only are people audience members, they're increasingly producers, right? But if we've all internalized the same racist logics, then we reproduce them, right? No matter how marginal we might be vis-a-vis the mainstream. And so I think the question of media literacy goes hand in hand with whatever kind of possibilities open up as a function of any attempt we make to truly democratize, to think about what benefits might accrue therefrom.
Great point. Yeah, great point, and a good point to end on, because we are actually, believe it or not, although we could go on forever on this topic, over time. So I just wanted to end by encouraging our audience members to attend our next panel, where we'll be discussing issues of voice and representation in the U.S. political system specifically. The panel will take place on Wednesday, April 21st from 5 p.m. to 6:15, and information on registering for the panel will be distributed in about a week. We have, as we've had all year long, another great set of panelists, so please, when you get the information, spread the word and consider attending. And with that, I'd just like to thank one more time our panelists for what I thought was a great, informative, moving discussion. I want to thank our audience for attending and ask you all to enjoy the rest of your evening, and I hope I see you at future panels. Thank you all very, very much for this.